The Harlem Hellfighters, also known as the 369th Infantry Regiment, were one of the most paramount and influential African American combat units to put themselves on the front lines during World War I and World War II. From being assigned to Europe in the French Army during the First World War to being relocated to the Southwest Pacific and Dutch New Guinea, the Hellfighters were commended for their courage and hardworking spirit. Despite their stories often being overshadowed or ignored completely, their resilience, determination, and grace they exemplified during the most difficult of times has never been erased. In attempting to exhume the rest of their experiences that have been ignored, we are highlighting the Harlem Hellfighter photo collection that is located in Fordham University's archive collection. The collection consists of 33 photos of the Harlem Hellfighters during the Second World War, between the years of 1939 and 1945. The collection was purchased from a book vendor by Patrice Kane, the previous head of Fordham's Archives and Special Collections. The purchase was only made possible with the help of the Bronx African American History Project. Although these photos were presented as being taken from World War I, the archival team later discovered they were from World War II. In February of 2015, Kane curated these photos for a public exhibition in honor of Black History Month. Despite this, there continues to be a significant lack of information listed about these photos in the Fordham archive. None of these photos includes names identifying the individuals in them, nor do they specify a specific location. In focusing on this collection, we want to expand this archive, providing as much context as possible to these photos. These single moments depicted by a single flash of a camera make it impossible for viewers to get a thorough understanding of these individual stories and experiences. Our first step in uncovering these stories is research.
At the onset of World War I, many African Americans were eager to fight in the war, but were often turned away from military service due to their race. However, the United States passed the Selective Service Act of 1917, which required all men from the ages of 21 to 30 to register for the draft. This included African Americans. Many African Americans enlisted, believing that their military service would change the way they were perceived by white Americans. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the group that would later become known as the Harlem Hellfighters, was reformed from the National Guard's 15th Regiment in New York in June of 1913. While training in South Carolina, the regiment experienced significant racism from the local community and other units. The group shipped out in December of 1917 and joined its brigade in France. Despite its designation and training as an infantry regiment, the unit was regulated to labor service duties instead of being assigned a combat mission. In April of 1918, the U.S. Army decided to assign the unit to the French Army for the duration of American participation in the war. They joined the French 15th Division, which was made up of French Black Senegalese troops. A French colonel of the American Expeditionary Forces was persuaded to write a pamphlet entitled Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops, which warned French civilian authorities of the alleged inferior nature and supposed racist tendencies of African Americans. In France, the 369th was treated as if they were no different from any other French unit. For the most part, the French did not show hatred towards them and did not racially segregate them. The Germans had made propaganda intended to be seen by African American units. It claimed that Germans had done nothing wrong to African Americans and that they should be fighting the U.S. instead, which had impressed them for years. One of the best-known aspects of the 369th is the Hellfighters Band. By the end of their tour, they'd become one of the most famous military bands throughout Europe. The band was under the direction of James Reese Europe, an early jazz band leader, arranger, and composer. The band itself is famous for introducing an until then unknown music called jazz to European audiences. When the 369th was set to return to the U.S. at the conclusion of the war on board the USS Virginia, the ship's cabin had them removed on, quote, the grounds that no blacks had ever traveled on an American battleship, end quote. Overall, the 369th Regiment was incredibly effective, and the French government awarded the Croix de Guerre to 170 individual members, as well as the regimental Croix de Guerre to the group as a whole. This, however, was at the cost of 1,500 casualties, the highest of any U.S. regiment. In 1933, the 369th Regiment Army was created to honor the regiment for their service. It still stands today in the heart of Harlem. When World War II began, 369th was reestablished as an element of the 93rd Infantry Division in the Army of the United States. The 93rd Infantry was a colored unit. They were deployed overseas and participated in labor and security operations in the Southwest Pacific. From April to June of 1945, they occupied an island in Dutch New Guinea, and they were then redeployed to the Philippines of July of 1945, where they conducted mop-up patrols until the Japanese surrendered in August.
The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill, was signed into law by wartime President Franklin D. Roosevelt on June 22, 1944, with the overarching goal of rewarding veterans for their service in the form of various social benefits, ranging from paid college tuition to low-cost home loans. These benefits were essential for the social mobility and well-being of the millions of people who had to risk their lives and spend their time in mandatory service to America during the war. However, as was the case with much of the legislation drafted in America throughout the 20th century, the bill was purposefully crafted to exclude the more than a million black veterans who had served, including renowned groups such as the Harlem Hellfighters and Tuskegee Airmen. The bill excluded these black servicemen and how, principally through the work of the staunch racist and chair of the House Veterans Committee, Mississippi Congressman John Rankin, it was implemented by state government rather than federal. The tactic of adhering to the quote-unquote state's right to choose has been a proponent of conservatives since the inception of America, and was overwhelmingly successful for Rankin and his fellow segregationists in a pre-civil rights America. For example, many black veterans were disproportionately and unfairly dishonorably discharged and therefore struggled to claim benefits. Crowds gathered to intimidate black veterans in various instances in which it was known that they were moving to claim benefits, such as moving into affordable housing. In other instances, the racist and belligerent crowds would simply seek out any black veterans in their area in hopes of beating and or lynching them. Across the nation, the state, not concerned with the advancement or even preservation of black communities, did nothing to intervene. Above all, the most consequential exclusion of black veterans in the post-GI Bill era occurred in the realms of housing and education. In terms of housing, the practice of redlining involved the systematic denial of loans or insurance to individuals based on the racial composition of neighborhoods. Black veterans were often confined to areas with inferior housing conditions, limited amenities, and diminished economic opportunities due to discriminatory redlining practices. Also, while the GI Bill did provide them with housing benefits, discrimination in the lending and housing markets restricted their ability to use the GI Bill to purchase homes or access housing in desirable neighborhoods. Similarly, in terms of education, although the GI Bill promised educational benefits, many institutions were racially segregated, and black veterans were often denied entry to predominantly white colleges and universities. HBCUs were integral to the education of black veterans. However, even these institutions were massively underfunded compared to predominantly white institutions. And more often than not, black veterans were relegated to vocational or technical training programs instead of receiving access to more advanced and prestigious educational opportunities. This further perpetuated racial disparities in employment and income. In response to both social and economic repression spurred by their pursuit of the GI Bill benefits, black veterans protested. They occupied segregated spaces, marched on national landmarks, and at times even fought against displays of racism, such as when a black soldier tried to stop a white police officer from unjustly arresting a black woman and was then shot for doing so, resulting in the Harlem Riot of 1943. Black veterans, in tandem with civil rights activists, even formed the National Emergency Committee Against Mob Violence in 1946, which met with President Harry Truman to argue for a federal anti-lynching law, but was eventually shut down in Congress by Southern Democrats. Today, because of the previously mentioned widespread instances of purposeful state-sanctioned exclusion that came with the GI Bill, Black Americans collectively have yet to catch up to white Americans socioeconomically. The millions of white GI Bill benefactors were able to establish a stable middle class for themselves and their descendants, subsequently leading to more sustainable and safer communities, as well as better schools and stronger local economies. Overall, one of the strongest 20th century examples of how expansive government social programs and spending can be beneficial to the working and middle class. In Harlem today, the home of the Harlem Hellfighters, the largest black community in New York City, and the historic cultural capital of Black America, The median income of black households continues to lag behind those of their white neighbors, which is also causing housing costs to become unaffordable for the black residents who were never offered substantial, all-encompassing social support by the government like white families throughout America were in the closing months and aftermath of World War II. The exclusion black veterans faced in regard to GI Bill benefits is a major reason for this occurrence not just in Harlem, but in numerous black communities across the nation. Although the Harlem Hellfighters Congressional Gold Medal Act was signed into law by President Biden in 2021, which is substantial progress in terms of historical recognition for the Hellfighters and black servicemen in general, we asked labor historian and author of Communist in Harlem During the Depression, Dr. Mark Nason, to talk about if there's any current tangible socioeconomic progress occurring for the black community in Harlem.
Like going off of what you just said, I know, like just to preface the part, we're doing a video essay, right, about the Hellfighters pictures. And in that video, I'm going to do a portion talking about how, they were received and they were basically excluded from the GI Bill after World War II. The neighborhoods were like disheveled by various forces, various different things, right? And so my question was basically, I know that Biden, he passed, he signed off on some bill that recognized the Hellfighters in 2021. But do you think, and that is definitely his history is important, as you said, and historical recognition is important. But I do want to know your opinion on this, because I kind of, when I saw that you wrote the Communist in Harlem During the Depression book, I was like, all right, this is a good question to ask, because you're like a labor historian and like an authoritative sense in this. Do you think, to tie it back to Harlem, since that's what our pictures are about, we can talk about the black American youth in New York, but to tie it back to Harlem, do you think that there's been tangible socioeconomic progress, either through like a legislator or in organizing? Do you actually see progress or in the last 50 years?
What I see is Harlem has been gentrified, and the people who tried to rebuild the community after the crack epidemic and all the fiscal crisis, the other tragedies which hit the neighborhood, a lot of those people are forced to move out. And so Harlem is no longer the major center of black culture in New York. I would say it's more Brooklyn than the Bronx now. And even, it's very interesting. Like when I was in college, if you said uptown, people meant Harlem. Now you say uptown, it means the Bronx. Like there's a Romeo Santos video where he's dealing with a couple of the famous artists from Latin America, and they're sitting in a penthouse with a pool. And they said, well, if we're going to do this video, we got to go uptown. So they head to the 173rd Street stop of the 2 and the 5 train. So, I think that Harlem is and this is true of Bed-Stuy as well, that these communities, which were historic centers of black culture and black institutional life, are being transformed before our eyes into something different. Now, there are a lot of the people who lived in those communities, their house prices went up, so they made money from it. Some people have been able to develop successful businesses. So, the middle class in these communities have benefited. But, the working class and poorer people, not only are they facing that rent's going up, but the stores coming in they can't afford. Like, who can afford a Whole Foods?
Yeah, that is true.
So, it's complicated. Harlem has got a lot of cool eating spots now, and hip stores and bars. One of my students actually owns a bar in Harlem called Angel of Harlem. An African-American student is one of my star students, is co-owners of this very hip bar in Harlem on Lenox Avenue. So that wouldn't have happened 40 years ago, but there's also people being pushed out. So it cuts a lot of different ways. That's the way I see it. And I don't consider myself an expert on Harlem. This is just from, periodic trips there to go to the Schomburg Center, or eat somewhere with friends. So, did a little research, found there were 500,000 people of African descent in the Bronx. the eighth largest concentration of urban African Americans in the country, and they were invisible not only to historians of the Bronx, but historians of Black life in New York City. The Schomburg Center did a book called The Black New Yorkers, 423 pages, 3 on the Bronx. It was all in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant. So I said, oh boy, when you have an important population that is invisible, how do you figure out how to write about them or how to explain what their lives were like? You do oral histories. And a lot of this went back to something that happened during the Great Depression, when the Federal Writers Project decided they were going to send graduate students in sociology and anthropology to interview more than 2,000 formerly enslaved people who were still alive. And they did all of those interviews. They were put in the Library of Congress, and most of them just sat there until the late 60s, when the Black Studies movement started, looking for those voices, and then it became the most single important source in pre-Civil War U.S. history. So I said, okay, with that as a model, let me start doing some oral histories. And
like Professor Nason discussed in the last clip, it's extremely difficult to consider from a curatorial or historian perspective how these people or these groups that were silenced throughout history, those that do not represent the victors in history, are able to tell their story, and how these groups are able to expand the historical archive with their perspective. Many of these groups, including the people that represent the Harlem Hellfighters that we're discussing in this video, have used a multimedia approach to expand the archive and fill in historical gaps. In the case of the 369th Historical Society, which is also known as the Harlem Hellfighters Historical Society, their goal is to collect, preserve, and maintain relics, books, papers, photographs, films, and other artifacts touching on the past history of the 369th Infantry Regiment, its allies, affiliates, and soldiers who served in the military of the United States. It also involves exhibiting and providing all of this information for the public, which is very evident in their website alone, where they have an entire virtual museum dedicated to highlighting the soldiers and its allies. And they have an About Us section that discusses their leaders and the work that those leaders have done, along with another section that has the info on what initiatives the Hellfighters Society is doing today. This is the foremost institution that is in place to represent the Harlem Hellfighters, and much of the media that they use can be seen as a means of expanding the historical archive, although it's not in a traditional museum case. They are using technology and things that are available to them outside of typical colonial-based institutions as a means of telling their story. Their virtual museum includes photos and videos that reflect on the 369th Regiment and their contributions to the United States military. One common thread that I noticed in the language used to describe the collection is a theme of triumph and celebration. There's little to no focus on the hardships faced by the regiment or the lack of recognition they faced from the United States. In fact, they highlight and commemorate the leaders whose names were known, as we know that many of the soldiers that fought to represent their country, the United States, in World War I, are not named in much of the record. This goes to show the further dehumanization and lack of recognition that these colonized people faced in history. But instead of overtly critiquing this, they covertly do this by highlighting those who were known and highlighting the recognition that they received from the French government through the Croix de Guerre, which was an award given to the soldiers by France, as the United States military did not want them to fight to represent their country, and these soldiers had to fight under the French military. The lack of recognition of the United States military through little to no photos highlighting them wearing any sort of memorabilia representing the US goes to further show the covert critiques of history that they're engaging in, while lifting up the voices of those that were silenced. I appreciate that they chose to focus more on those people that were ignored rather than highlighting the actions of the US. It gives agency back to the soldiers who were ignored and whose agency was taken away from them by the inability to tell their story. Although they did not state it, they showcase the shortcomings of how the US government handled the 369th Regiment. Many of the photos showcase the volume of soldiers that went to fight for the wars, but only few were named or recognized. Okay. In the background here we see a picture of the Standing on Fifth, which highlights the people that supported the Harlem Hellfighters when they went off to war and when they came back. We could see that once again, the community that supported them was made up of many Black and brown people. And these photographs highlighting this further give agency back to people whose stories were ignored. In the second photo, also included in the Historical Society's virtual museum, we see the hero's welcome that they received when they came back from the war. We once again, we also see that many of the people that welcomed them with open arms were Black and brown people. I don't think that it was unintentional that a lot of these photographs in their virtual museum highlight this community demographic. They are inadvertently criticizing the poor treatment that they received while taking a look on the brighter side of the situation by highlighting those that were there for them and that supported them as they returned home to cheers from their community, but were also met with racist treatment by the country that they risked their lives for. They were isolated by their government and white soldiers, which forced them to fight under France during the war. However, much of the commemoration that they highlight in their historical society, which is the main institution used to represent the Harlem Hellfighters today, showcases the triumphant support that they received from the communities in Harlem and other African Americans. This is why it's important for institutions like these to be here today, and for the expansion of the archive to include the voices of the colonized or the oppressed, so that we don't forget those people that were there actively taking a role in history. They were not passively on the bysides. They were there, involved in the historical canon, and so we should include them in the record. According to the American Battle Monuments Commission, these men spent more time in continuous combat than any other American unit of its size, with 191 days in the frontline trenches, according to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. When we consider this great action that these men took for their country, why then are we unable to name the soldiers in these photographical archives? This further highlights the Eurocentric focus on the historical record, which has resulted in these colonized people needing to tell their stories themselves using the limited information available to them. As a result, we saw in the virtual museum of the Harlem Hellfighters Historical Society that few of the soldiers in these photographs were named. However, the Historical Society has also been able to engage with more institutionalized bodies like the New York City Parks Association due to social progression and political pressure as a means of recognizing the 369th Regiment. In this photograph, which is not very clear, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go and take a picture myself of the monument. We see a memorial named the 369th Infantry Regiment Memorial, or Harlem Hellfighters Obelisk Memorial, which was erected on 142nd Street and Fifth Avenue and commemorates a show of strength of the men in bronze in 1918. This area was around the same region where we saw people in the previous photo doing the walk on Fifth, and where we saw community members coming out in droves to welcome the Hellfighters back home. The event is quoted on the obelisk as "in memory of the 1918 Meuse-Argonne offensive." The memorial is an obelisk in 3 sections with engraved and painted inscriptions made of gray granite. It stands 12 feet and 4 inches tall and was dedicated in September of 2006 by its donors, the 369th Historical Society and Veterans Association. Ironically, the monument was fabricated by a French company, J.P. Chaudron Pompes Funèbres Foussières France, and it's once again highlights the fact that the memory of these soldiers were added to the archive in France before their memory was erected in the United States, much like the fact that the soldiers were recognized for their efforts in the war by France by being given the Croix de Guerre before they were even recognized by the US government. This theme of the Hellfighters being recognized years later and their perspective being added to the historical archive many, many years after their service by the US is highlighted once again by this man right here, who is one of the few men that we have named from this group of soldiers, who is named Henry Johnson. Sergeant Henry Johnson, was amongst the soldiers awarded with the Croix de Guerre in 1918 by France for their service in World War I. However, upon returning to the US, he was amongst the black soldiers that remained unrecognized for their service in the United States. Despite serving on the front lines of war, they were not awarded like their white counterparts. However, many years later, in 1996, 67 years after his passing, Johnson was awarded with the Purple Heart. This was then followed by him posthumously receiving the Distinguished Service Cross in 2002. This was seen as a precedent for the Congressional Medal of Honor bill brought forth in 2021. Imagine if it was 67 years after his passing in 1996. How many years later, in almost 40 years later, in 2021, the entire group of soldiers were being commemorated through legislation by the United States government. The Congressional Medal of Honor bill sought to recognize the entire 369th Regiment with the Congressional Gold Medal for their service to their country. The bill was sponsored by Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand before it was ratified by President Joe Biden. I want to call back to a point made by Professor Nason in the beginning of this section, when he called us to question the difficulties faced by historians and by art curators in finding ways to expand the historical archive when much of these histories of the oppressed people were not recorded. We don't have a lot of freedom to do this when we want to remain more fact based from a historian's perspective. But artists have the ability to engage with this and fill these historical gaps creatively through techniques like critical fabulation, which was used in this case by artist Bisa Butler, who's a Black artist that creates work today as a means of highlighting these soldiers whose stories were forgotten. In her piece entitled Don't Tread on Me, Goddamn, Let's Go, the Harlem Hellfighters, which is dated 2021 to 2022, Butler highlights these men who were originally photographed in 1919 in Stockholm after their return from World War I, as a way of bringing agency to this story. Butler's piece was appliqued and quilted cottons, silk, wool, and velvet, and was showcased in the Smithsonian American Art Museum, given on gift by David Bonderman, and the photograph here was taken by Lee Stallsworth. Butler uses a traditionally African American medium of quilting, which has strong ties to resistance for African Americans, along with these bright Kool-Aid colors, is what they're called, which were a symbol of resistance during the Black Power movement, to communicate her goal of highlighting the strength of the figures she depicts. Generally, this is a common thread in Butler's work, as she aims to give voices into stories untold in African American history through a traditional African American medium. It's a form of activism through art that actively engages in breaking down historical barriers and placing these African American figures into the historical canon. In this quote from an interview done with Bisa Butler on the quilt that she created to commemorate the Harlem Hellfighters, they say that I took to their example to see for myself that the triumphs we experience today will outlast tyrants, and that nothing can ever erase them, not time, not death. These protectors of our nation fought and put their very bodies and their lives on the line. My work is to continue to lift them up in history so that they can be seen in public spaces where their heroic sacrifices become part of the American quest to fight against oppression and freedom. In this case, Butler engages in a sort of critical fabulation. Typically, we see that critical fabulation involves a realistic expansion of the historical archive to fill in historical gaps for stories that were left untold. For instance, we can see that a book written on the experience of an enslaved person trying to escape from their plantation, who might be recorded on the plantation and then later recorded when they're free, would fill in the gap on that journey through the use of critical fabulation by engaging in a realistic interpretation of what that journey might be like. In this case, Butler says that the men all wear the croix de guerre awarded to the regiment in 1918 by the French government. But in creating the quilt, she wanted to perform an act of what she calls restorative history with her artwork. So she does not call what she engages in critical fabulation. This is just based on further research on how historians have coined the term. But Butler chooses to engage in what she calls restorative history in her art as she tells the soldier's story. She honors the men in a way that the US government never did by awarding them the gold medals they deserve in their quilt. It's very funny because the quilt is dated 2021 to 2022, which is ironically the same time period in which Joe Biden symbolically awarded these Hellfighters with the Congressional Gold Medal. So it took that long for any legislative expansion of the archive to occur. And it's extremely ironic that Butler was able to do this artistically, independently, in the same time period. Butler's engagement in her own version of critical fabulation, which was a term coined by African American historian Sadiah Hartman, expanded the historical archive of the Harlem Hellfighters through art by creating a totally new perspective on their experience, much like the work that was engaged by other organizations or groups or even individuals that worked to add their perspective into the historical archive, like the Historical Society, or even the work that my friends and I are doing here today, where we continue this expansion of the archive and the introduction of new perspectives in history through our own means of critical fabulation by piecing together the connections of these actions throughout history by the colonized and the ways that they're able to tell their story, specifically in the case of the Harlem Hellfighters. We're looking at a way through this video to hopefully fill in historical gaps and highlight voices that were silenced. We hope that this video is able to give agency, give a voice to these people so that their story is further recognized, as we don't want it to be forgotten. They are meaningful participants in history. And through our own means of critical fabulation with this video essay, I hope to highlight how art and how activism is all connected in a way of the colonized or the oppressed telling their story and using or reclaiming that agency that was taken away from them.
Despite these recent examples of praise and recognition for the Harlem Hellfighters, this is only the start of the journey towards reclaiming the stories and identities of Black veterans. We now return to these photos. Although our project aims to highlight these stories and expand their archival canon, it also serves as a call to action, one that encourages the public to contribute to the expansion process as well. The fact that we were unable to get in contact with those who we wanted to, in order to get more information about these soldiers and even a centralized authority such as the Historical Society is a testament to the ever-present struggle to provide voices to the marginalized. Fordham's Harlem Hellfighter collection is only a fraction of the photos of these soldiers and their overall history that have been continued to be decontextualized.
What's the time? 9, all in line. All right, boys, now take it slow. Are you ready? Eddie, very good, Eddie. Over the top, let's go. Quiet, quiet, else to start a riot. Keep your proper distance, follow along. Hover, hover, and when you see me hover, obey my orders and you won't go wrong. There's a minute bus coming, look out. Hear that roar, there's one more, stand fast, for there's a very light. Don't gasp for to find you all right. Don't start the bumming with those hand grenades. There's a machine gun, the holy stage. Alert, gas, put on your mask, adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the fight barrage. Down, hug the ground, push the can, don't stand. Creep and crawl, follow me, that's all. What do you hear? Nothing near, don't fear, all clear. That's the life of a soul when you take up patrol. Out in no man's land, ain't it grand? Out in no man's